Hi, everybody. This is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society and professor in environmental studies at Dartmouth. We usually have our free pizza lunches on Wednesdays all around the Dartmouth campus. Could everybody please mute themselves so we don't get feedback? And so this is our first free pizza lunch. And so instead of feeding you mediocre pizza, we're just going to be talking about different types of topics. And we're really excited. We had 85 people sign up for this event, and we're really looking forward to the conversation. Stephanie, maybe you're able to mute everybody. And so for the questions, Kristen's going to be driving the presentation. I'll speak for about 15-20 minutes on the chapter, and then we'll be taking questions. Send your questions to the moderator, and then Stephanie will be able to read them. And if we have some time at the end, then we can do some other formats as well. So and unmute people. So we'll see how this works. This is the first one of these that we're done, so we're pretty excited. So first slide, please. Okay, that's good. Thank you. So I was invited to write this book chapter by a colleague, Philippe Tortel, who's at University of British Columbia in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. A book that's a retrospective looking at Earth, environment, energy, 50 years on from Earth Day in 1970. And for me, this is a different kind of writing than I usually do. And to be able to think about how energy works, what some of the challenges are over the last 50 years, what some of the challenges are going forward, was a really interesting and different kind of writing experience than I usually do. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, and this first slide kind of highlights it, is how this right now, this time period that we live in, this is the energy anomaly. In the last 10,000 years, humans have kind of lived in organized societies around the planet. How we've used energy has been pretty similar to how Odysseus used it in the Odyssey. And his journey going back using wind, using human power to move, was pretty much how humans always used energy. And so this component of energy in human society has always been a link with animals and resources like the wind and water and other human beings. 70 to 90% of us as peasants, as slaves, as serfs, providing energy resources to make society work. And I also wanted to point out that there's always been also a very gendered component to how societies have produced energy and used energy that actually continues today as we think about how energy is used around the world. When we're thinking about energy in context, and especially this modern energy period, while there's been progress and we're using energy and having more access to lighting, to heat, to mobility than any other time before, there are also externalities associated with that, costs associated with energy production. For example, WHO, the World Health Organization, estimates that 4.2 million people a year die prematurely from air quality issues. And we know with the latest COVID-19 crisis, people who live in areas with bad air quality have been oftentimes more susceptible to the virus. So when I taught energy and environment last term, many of the students were really surprised that air quality remains such an important global issue. But as we're thinking about energy, it's embedded in all of our societies, all of our devices, embedded in anything from the paper towels we use to our cell phones to the reading glasses I'm going to put on now to be able to read the rest of my notes. One of the pieces in the chapter as well we examined were some of the catastrophic fails of the energy system. You know, in part, Earth Day back in 1970 was spurred by the Santa Barbara oil spill, where 3 billions of oil leaked from an offshore platform and polluted the beaches of Santa Barbara. I think it's ironic now that, as we're having this global health crisis, that oil is again being stored now offshore in super tankers. So if you think 50 years ahead, kind of all of the oil and how that's also affecting the environment. But there have been other spills, of course, in our lifetimes, the Exxon Valdez, BP Deepwater Horizon. There's natural gas explosions. We can think about the disasters associated with nuclear, with Chernobyl, Fukushima Daiichi, 3 Mile Island. And so Earth Day came in part in the 70s, but it's been something that's been a part of our history, our collective history in the West in particular, for the last 50 years. And over that time period, our dependence on energy has only increased. From 1970 to today, per capita globally, we're using 45% more energy. Our emissions, of course, from the air quality we talked about earlier, but also carbon dioxide has increased from 320 parts per million to 410 parts per million over that same time period. And until this crisis, it seemed to be continuing to increase unabated. In 2018, the emissions went up 3%. And so a lot of scholars in the energy world work a lot on energy transitions. And we focus our research on how we're going to transition our societies from a world away from fossil fuels. Next slide, please, Kristen. And I just wanted to ground us in kind of how we use energy today. And this is from BP. And the green on the bottom is oil. The red is natural gas. The gray is coal. Could you click it once more, please, Kristen? The circled part is our carbon-free energy. And so when we're thinking about how globally we use energy and how we would need to transform it to respond to any carbon managed world, what we're talking about is changing fundamentally how we produce energy globally. And so the energy transition that a lot of us focus on, we're looking at the $300 billion a year spent on renewables all around the world. And this is great, but it's insufficient for the problem at hand. Today, 80% of the energy used is fossil fuels. Now this is down from 97% back in 1970, but the absolute growth of energy has kind of taken away any of those changes. And so I think instead of thinking about energy transitions as substitutive, I think we need to think about them as additive. While in North America, you really don't use that much wood fuel anymore, globally more wood than ever is used. And while societies like the European Union have switched away and are able to decrease energy uses, in the other parts of the world, energy demand is growing rapidly. Next slide, please, Kristen. And so when we're thinking about the energy transition, each one of these blocks I'll be showing you is roughly 1 billion people. There are those of us in the world who are the energy rich, who have a lot of energy in our lives. In the chapter, I talked about how I use energy, whether it's for my electric toothbrush or the refrigerator or the electric lighting. Next click, please, Kristen. And we can also think about the people in the world that don't have any access to electricity, the 1.1 billion people on the planet that don't have access to electricity. It's about 2 to 3 billion that don't have access to clean cooking fuels. And we think a lot about providing basic energy services. Energy is a human right. Next click, please. But the people driving the planet are the 4 billion people in the middle whose energy demand is growing rapidly. In the book, I shared a story about my former PhD student from Nepal, Vivek Bhandari, who talked about in Kathmandu for years, you would have a map of the city with which hours a day you would have electricity. Everybody in the city reorganized their activities to work when they had access to power. That's changed since then. There's some smart electrical engineers who figured out different ways to increase supply to the population. And now in the industrial sector, there's only about 4 hours of shortages today. But when you think about energy and how it's used, it's embedded in society. It's embedded in different parts of the world. It's embedded in how it works. So in the chapter, we talked a little bit about the growth in places like India, like China, where demand in China from 2000 to today has grown 250% per capita. In India, 54%. It's these orange blocks that don't have enough energy today that are driving the global energy futures. And so when we came together in Paris in 2015, 89% of global emissions were part of the conversation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and respond to a changing climate. And the amount of energy pledged at the time was very, very ambitious. But what we're really talking about here is a systematic change. It's more than just technologies. And while the $900 billion invested in lower carbon technologies today is a lot, it's about a third of what the International Energy Agency estimates we need to be able to meet any of those goals. And next slide, please. And then just kind of click through these. We've been teaching Energy 101, that's perfect, just stay right there, every fall now for about 3 years. This was a slide, I think, from 2 years ago that we put together, but every year we teach, there's a series of energy-related disasters that affect energy access around the world. And I think one of the challenges is that we're not only reducing emissions globally to respond to climate change, we're also doing it at a time where we're locked into systematic change. So we're looking at mitigation and adaptation to a changing climate simultaneously. You have places like Davenport, Iowa, that last year had 200 days at the flood stage and a fundamental shift in the watershed rainfall patterns in the upper Mississippi. Our energy infrastructure, our basic infrastructure isn't built for the world that we're coming into today. And so if we're thinking about reliable energy systems for humans in the decades to come, we're thinking about huge investments, both hardening infrastructure, but also softening infrastructure to deal with the climate change coming forward. Next slide, please. So this is all happening, this great acceleration in a world that's human driven. So we're talking about energy today. We could be having this conversation about food systems. We could be having this conversation about how we've moved around the world. One of the conversations I'd like to have with you is how this last month or two has made you think differently about the energy systems that we're all engaging with today. I'm here with my husband in Copenhagen, and the EU Green Deal, the 100 billion euros that they've committed to reducing emissions is really also seen as a fundamental part of their recovery from COVID. And so you have different parts of the world that are responding to this very differently. We ended the book chapter going back to the Greeks and talking about this idea of hubris, this idea of being punished by the Greek gods only when you had this hubris and thought you knew more than they did. Whether it was Odysseus getting sent on his journey because of his ideas, or getting fired, you know, how we go forward, that none of us know. All of the uncertainties embedded in how the climate is changing, what will be available in the future, is something that I think is important to cultivate. Energy humility is important to cultivate as we go forward into this very, very uncertain world. So with that, I look forward to conversations and questions. And Stephanie, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to open it up, and I'd love to hear from you guys as well. Thanks very much. No questions yet. Okay, guys, write a question. Or we can, if people want to raise your hand, if you go down to the bottom, there's manage participants, and you can click on raise your hand there. There's also a chat button where you can put your question on the bottom. So how will the possibility of nuclear fusion contribute to an energy transition? You know, one of the things that I've been really interested in given this crisis is how in past times of economic duress, the structure of energy infrastructure and investments has shifted. So if you look back at after 2000, after 2007-8, the size of energy investments went down half to a third of what it was before. And it took not just 1 or 2 years to recover, but almost triple that. One of the things that I've been thinking about post-COVID in this new economic reality that we're moving into is how will the size of investments in energy infrastructure be shifted and change into the future. And given our experience with much smaller crises, I think smaller technologies that are more distributed and more scalable will be very, very potentially favored in the future environment, as opposed to really big, expensive technologies and new and untested technologies. For example, the Vogel plant down in Georgia, I think is at $13 billion now. I mean, I don't think anyone has any kind of appetite for that today. And so I think it'll be interesting to see as we appreciate and there's less uncertainty around the economic realities in the years to come, where the investments will lie. My colleagues who I've talked to who work in the energy investing space are talking about utilities investing in basic maintenance and having the ability to go there. So there's a next question. With the price of oil so low, how does that impact our conversion to renewables? Will there still be government incentives? This is a really great question. One of the pieces that we have been watching lately is these crazy shifts in oil markets. I don't know how many of you appreciated that the price of oil, West Texas Intermediate, yesterday was negative for the first time since they've been pumping oil. I mean, this is kind of uncharted territory. In the past, we have used the price of oil as a comparison to either say investing in these electric vehicles or other alternative technologies is a good investment. I think this is a really interesting uncharted time, and the decrease in demand in the oil sector highlights to you just how inelastic that commodity is. For example, aviation fuel now is down 75% globally. And so you've seen, I think transportation fuel is down about 33%. And so without a carbon tax, how that affects future investments, I think is a really interesting question. I think one of the other questions is how the prices of, or just contextual variables, I guess, is how the prices of renewables has decreased significantly over the past decade to now a point where they're very cost effective. So how we go forward, how we think about carbon going forward, this will be interesting too. The long-term impacts of the recent oil crash, I think are too soon to be fully appreciated. When we talked to one of our former alums who's an oil trader, he was saying for the first time in his experience, there's no new welling. People are shutting things down and the prices in the field are very different than they are in the market. They're almost negative. And as I started this talk, we talked about how a lot of oil now is being stored in super tankers offshore. And what a strange, kind of ironic point that is for Earth Day, 50 years on, when oil was again one of the issues. Here's a question from Scott Fisher. What do you think is the #1 behavioral change a society or any aspect of society could adopt to move toward a more sustainable future? You know, it's interesting having this question today. I don't know how a lot of you feel about your last month, but I have appreciated that behavioral change, which we before thought was impossible, is actually pretty possible. And there's different trade-offs with it. I really miss seeing my colleagues at work, but I also appreciate that we all need to be safe right now. And I appreciate that our energy use is a lot less when we're not flying all over the world, when we're not driving to and from work, when we're not going to all kinds of different sporting and entertainment events. And a lot of the behavioral change work that we had been talked about before was deemed impossible. And now we're doing it. So actually this for us is a research project that we kind of want to look into. I mean, from your perspectives, what are some of the things that you're doing now that you'd like to keep doing? So question, do you think that the administration will use the negative price of oil to justify increased subsidies to the oil companies? I appreciate that in many parts of the US, this is a very politically linked in industry, and that subsidies to all kinds of industries that I never thought would be subsidized are a big part of the policies of our current administration. And I think I'll leave that there. And we have a raised hand here. Let me see if I can unmute you, Dave.
I think you did. Can
okay,
you hear me?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, it was interesting that you were talking about the current crisis and what it might do to energy investment. I spent about 30 years raising capital for energy investments before I retired, and my experience has been that what really drives where the investment is more public policy than anything else. And every time there's been a big change in public policy, there's been huge unintended consequences that's driven capital to what might be considered the wrong places, or has created huge problems for the existing players. And I think the real question is, how do we get public policy aligned with our real needs?
Yeah, I mean, this has actually been a fascinating time to think about the role of public policy, and you see such differences state to state. And with Dartmouth students being all over the country, all over the world, you really can see the very, very important role that public policy is playing in shaping our future societies. My colleague is the incoming dean at the Evans School at the University of Washington Public Policy School. And said that applications are up about 30% this year. I think there's a realization in a lot of students that how important this is going forward. I agree with you completely. Anyone else want to raise your hand? That's just the bottom. If you go to manage participants, you can push your button there. Thanks. Thank you very much, Steve. There was another question. How do you recommend that we address, this is from Quang Dang. How do you recommend that we address the challenge of climate change when there are key government leaders and officials and even ordinary citizens who still don't believe in the science? I'm going to posit that this is primarily a US problem. You can travel pretty far around the rest of the world where the science component of this story is not controversial at all. And maybe in addition to public policy, we can point to education. But I think it's been made a controversial issue in the US. I think we've had lots of concerted political campaigns to drive the doubt. There's a wonderful book, Merchants of Doubt, that kind of highlights these different fundings. There's another one called Dark Money that looks at the investments and kind of pushing some of these can we call them alternative narratives forward. This is a time, and information is power, and information is being used to control power in some pretty important ways right now. Asked again from Mary, will the negative price of oil be used to increase the subsidies to companies? I think that's a really good question. I could see it happening. I am not sure. Do you have any thoughts, Mary? So storage, there's a, from John Tuttle, storage and super tankers hold an 8-day supply for US at 20 million barrels a day, just in time market. In 2009, there was a really nice article in The Guardian that was talking about traders use the same super tanker storage techniques in 2009 to be able to store oil offshore and time the market, hoping that prices would get better in the future. And I think those same tactics are being used today. With prices so low and demand so depressed, it's a very, very interesting time. Let me see if there's a few more that I missed back here. Have you found any promising examples of systematic change considering both energy demand and the inequity of communities most impacted by climate change and its many natural disasters? I think there's lots of points of light and a lot of communities that are doing many things on their own. I'm also really interested in some of the bigger pressure and bigger changes that we're seeing around the world in terms of interest in environmental, social, governance, investment, and thinking about how we really shape our systems for the future. And I think this question of inequities and how it affects different communities really plays out differently in different parts of the world. In the US, it's particularly acute right now when it comes to all aspects of life. I don't think that's the case as much in Northern Europe. In East Africa, where I used to live, on my way here, I was sitting next to a woman who worked in Uganda on child HIV transmissions. And we were talking about the energy situation in Uganda and how it really intersected with healthcare and basic human ability to get things done. And so I think there's a lot of places in the world where these inequities are shaped by even bigger issues as they go forward too. But there's a lot of investment in renewables there that she was very, very proud of. So here is a question from Anna. How sizable is an impact do you think our lack of travel/economic activity due to COVID-19 has had in terms of lower contribution to climate change? And what lessons do you think we can broadly take away from this? I think back to that study that we had talked about doing with students. What are you willing to give up? I mean, personally, there are some things I think are a little bit more productive now. I'm having lots of meetings with different alumni all over the country. And for me, doing this by Zoom is a heck of a lot more convenient than flying all the way to San Francisco for a 1-hour meeting and flying back. That's 3 days and a lot of jet lag for 1 or 2 hours. And so in some ways, being able to connect with people virtually is providing a level of access and conversation that I think in some instances is working surprisingly well. Travel was very, very cheap for the last 5 or 6 years. And while some communities in the Netherlands and others, young people were refusing to fly, in the US, that's very, very hard because we don't have many alternatives to get between our major metropolitan areas. We haven't invested in high-speed rail. We haven't invested in other infrastructure. When I lived in China, we put in, I was there in 2010, and 5 years later, they had a high-speed train network. It used to be 18 hours from Beijing to Shanghai by train. When I was there, it was 10. Now it's 5, city center to city center. That would make the time from Boston to Chicago about 5 hours. I mean, that would be a real game changer if we had different types of infrastructure in this country, but we haven't invested in it. So I think the and society component of our Irving Institute is really important for this type of question, because I think in different environments and different societies, you can play this out very, very differently. just based on the other infrastructures you have available to you. There's a few more messages. Iris Wang, do you think it's likely for a carbon tax to be implemented soon enough to prevent catastrophic consequences of climate change that have already been set in motion? No, I don't. I know for years, economists have been saying the climate change is great. It'll help us reprioritize everything. Politically in the United States, it has proven to be impossible. I don't see that changing. I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I'll be really happy. There's some things I'll be really happy to be wrong about. That is one of them. Another thing that I like to look at in my own research is another thing that I like to look at in my own research is where we've been wrong about our projections of low carbon technologies. Every year, the Energy Information Administration puts out the annual energy outlook, where they project the next 20 years of how the US will be using energy. In the 1999 AEO, which projected energy use from 2000 to 2020, they projected that there would be 800 megawatts of new wind in the United States. We now have about 95,000 megawatts. So we, the experts, were wrong by 2 orders of magnitude because we didn't get, we had all these limits on our system. It couldn't be more than a gigawatt a year. You didn't have access to transmission, so you couldn't do this much, and really the price. And so this is a global system of technological innovation funded and fueled by, as David said, local policies and priorities, deployed in all kinds of different environments with concurrent advances in weather forecasting that allows the grids to predict wind, and control systems that allows grid operators to seamlessly have wind bid into our energy markets. With the ability as well to think about different technological configurations and ownership structures like community wind or community solar that are popping up in different parts of the US now. So I get my hope from the fact I and other energy experts have been really, really wrong in the past. And I only hope that going forward, things that we thought were impossible today are going to be commonplace in 20 years. Ed Kern asks, a lot of CO2 flying back and forth to San Francisco. Would the Irving Institute agree to no staff air travel? Ed, this is a great question. Thank you very much for that. We can talk to the provost and our need to finish the fundraising to get everything going. But I, for one, think that it'd be a really interesting choice to even think about what types of offsets we as academics could participate in and whether we could fund those with our different projects. Here's a question. I wonder if Aaron Mansoor wants to comment on the carbon tax question. Aaron, we saw that you're here. Do you want to comment? Please raise your hand if you do, and we can unmute you.
Sorry, I unmuted myself.
Awesome.
All right.
Hey, Aaron.
Hey, how are you doing? Yeah, I mean, I think economists have recognized that this is one of the hardest problems to solve, being a global public goods issue. And a lot of the people who are going to be affected by climate change aren't even born yet. And so trying to think about typical solutions has been a challenge. And so I think a lot of it is negotiations and trying to find a way to implement some carbon policy. A carbon tax, economists have talked about as being great, but doing something at this point is more important. You know, I'm a big fan of carbon taxes, and if we can do that, that's great. We're going to save a lot of money and achieve greater reductions at a lower cost. And you know, if that's where we go, great. But it's such a hard problem to solve. So anyway, those are my 2 cents.
Thanks, Aaron. And one of the things I've really appreciated is, depending on where you sit on the planet, how politically feasible that is or not really differs. I I mean, and we all can always look at the Norways of the world that have tried these things and seen different results and compare it with places that haven't been able to do that. But I think you're right, we got to do something. And the one piece about this for me is this is an all hands on deck problem. I mean, this is something that's going to be with us for the next generations. And I think this is why it's such a great problem for Dartmouth students, Dartmouth alumni, and our community to really sink our teeth into, because this is important for us and our future survival on the planet. Here's a question from Iris again. If the public sector fails to take action, is there evidence that the private sector has or can take action to help us transition to more sustainable energy? So Iris, one of the things that I hope you saw in that chart, if you leave with nothing else, leave with there's 2 billion of us that use most of the energy historically on the planet and have too much. And then there's the 4 billion in the middle that are driving that future demand. And so really, if you're thinking about the important pieces of policy going forward, it's how we decarbonize our societies, but it's really that block in the middle that's going to be driving the shape of future emissions. And so thinking about public sector, I want you to think about it in a nuanced way and think about it globally. And private sector investment and engagement is absolutely essential. Public sector monies in and of themselves are not enough. And whether or not the private sector is going to be willing to step up to the plate and actually invest in the future of all of our societies is a wonderful question. And it's one that I think you can see some examples of very positively and others not so much. And so how this shapes out in the future, and as David said before, how the policy and incentive environments evolve around the world to support these different investments, I think is really, really important going forward too. There was another question from Alexa. I read recently that California was curtailing renewables because of reduced energy demand. Why are renewables being curtailed as opposed to fossil fuels? So one of the challenges, and Aaron gives a great lecture on this with how energy markets work, is this idea of matching supply and demand. And there's some limits in terms of how different parts of your electricity system can be turned on and off and how rapidly they can be turned on and off. So if you have, for example, an hour of electricity load and you're trying to ensure that you have, let's say 1,000 kilowatt hours in our very small system, you have different generators that are providing that power. And if you have too much on your system, you're going to have to curtail it. How it gets curtailed in different electricity markets differs slightly. For example, in the upper Midwest, renewables bid in to the electricity market like any other, and then it's an economically ordered dispatch that Aaron talks about really well in some of the lectures he's done for Energy 101. Maybe if you sign up, we can do it again in the fall. If you have too much power, you need to curtail it on your system, and it just depends on where it is. It depends on what the grid looks like. It depends on what other resources are there. Some plants can't ramp up or down as rapidly. So I think in some systems, one of the other research projects we talked about is looking at how this reduced demand has affected energy system operation. And I've heard places like PJM, kind of the mid-Atlantic grid, saying that they have decreased demand 3 to 5%. If anyone else has any more information on that or some good links, please feel free to share it, because I think this is a really interesting time to think about how us not moving around really reshapes energy use, not only in the US, but around the world. Okay, there was another question. There are no super tankers for electricity, says Ed Kern. That's absolutely true. And so this question of storing electricity is one that has taken a lot of people's minds, but you're also thinking about the power of the grid and the power of the grid to ensure that resources over a larger area are able to be used. And that can also help you not curtail renewable resources too. So if you take the class next year, we can go over exactly how it works and give you a much better explanation to your question. So Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to raise their hand or have any comments or questions? We have a bunch of different, oh, Aaron, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so just gonna add, so every year around this time, we have what's called the duck curve in California, as you were talking about.
Yep.
And so because of local transmission congestion, even though renewables are zero priced and free to produce on the margin, sometimes there's congestion, as you were talking about. I've been doing some work the last couple of weeks looking at how our energy use has dropped in this country. What we're finding is that electricity consumption is about 5% down, controlling for weather across the nation, with some areas that were early movers in policy, dropping electricity consumption about 10%. Transportation's down about 40% across the US, a little bit of variation there. And so we're trying to look at the air quality effects of this. Just to your point of what can be done. Obviously, what we're doing is not something we want to be doing, but just the order of magnitude of how much energy we can reduce is interesting to see.
Well, and when you hear the stories globally of, you know, the villages in India that hadn't seen the Himalayas for 30 years, and suddenly it clears up and you can see the mountains again. You appreciate that we have lived with air pollution that affects not only our health, but also our environment in really significant ways. I want to plug, Kristen, do we have the slide on the upcoming events? Yes. So one of the things I love about the team at the IAS is how just excited they have been in engaging and thinking about how we can best be part of the Dartmouth community during these really crazy weeks. And so thinking about community creation through events like this, we'll be doing our Dartmouth Energy Collaborative events. These are sponsored by us at Irving, the Rever Center, the Sustainability Office, Thayer School. And we've also been working to have other events with other partners. So I don't know how many of you have seen The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. In celebration of Earth Day, we're working with the HOP. You can watch the film on Netflix, but tonight, William, who's a Dartmouth alum, originally from Malawi, and when he was 13, built a wind turbine to save his village. We'll be talking and answering questions. So that should be a good, you know, you asked before about a good highlight story. This will be a super event to kind of highlight what one person did and what they're doing today. We also are trying to pull on our alumni. So any of you alums who work in the energy space and want to speak to Dartmouth students about your career, contact Melissa Weinstein, contact us at the Irving Institute. This first Alumni Sparks event for energy careers will be Dan Calafadis, who worked at 3 Degrees and in the renewable space for his career. And we wanted to do this as well because we've heard from a lot of the students that there's just so much uncertainty now and kind of your careers and what the economy will mean and everything like that. So one of our goals was to kind of show the different people working in and across this area and how their careers went. I mean, at that time, there was nothing supporting work and energy at Dartmouth, and yet today there's 3,700 alums who work in and across the energy space. And so connecting you to them, our hope is will help to strengthen that network going forward as well. So this was one chapter of this book, Earth 2020. On Friday, there will be three other authors joining me and the editor, Philippe Tortel. We'll have Sheila Jazanoff from MIT, as well as blanking on name. It's going to be on the website in a few minutes, from Caltech and also from York University in Canada. Talking about the book and their respective chapters. So you'll have a climate change perspective, you'll have a different social anthropological perspective, and another environmental perspective as well. So that's Friday, and it will be actually noon Eastern time, not 11. It'll be 9 a.m. Pacific, noon in in Eastern time. And we look forward to that event as well. And we're, again, putting together a whole calendar of events like these lunches and others. And if you have any other ideas or any suggestions or want to partner with us, please reach out. We're looking to support you and the community in these conversations as we go forward over these next months where we're all working remotely. Tuck Sustainability also have other programming this term. And so folks should check out their websites as well. We're trying to kind of cross-pollinate and make sure everything is listed everywhere, but please be sure to check out the Rever Center and also the sustainability work too. Any other announcements from any of the IES team? Amanda or Stephen or Kristen? Well, I want to thank everybody for coming to this. It's been great to, honestly, to see you virtually is such a treat for all of us. And so being able to see everybody and have you be part of our conversations these days is really wonderful. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. We hope to talk to you soon, and we look forward to seeing you at these other events. And again, if you have any ideas, please feel free to reach out. Thanks again. Bye, everyone.